The air in the Logan family dining room was a familiar cocktail of vanilla-scented wax, sugar, and unspoken tensions. It clung to the back of Thomas's throat, thick as the frosting on the elaborate three-tiered chocolate cake his mother, Eleanor, had spent all afternoon perfecting. Around the oval table, the usual cast was assembled. Eleanor, her smile tight and bright, his father, Richard, already loosening his tie, a half-empty glass of scotch glinting in the candlelight, and me, Sam, Thomas's best friend since we were both knee-high and covered in sandbox grit. And of course, Chloe. She sat opposite Thomas, her posture perfect, a small, serene smile playing on her lips. Her blonde hair was a waterfall of silk over one shoulder, and in the flickering glow of the 24 candles, she looked like something from a dream, or maybe a very tasteful painting. Chloe had been Thomas's girlfriend for 2 years, and in that time she had woven herself into the fabric of the Logan family with a quiet, relentless determination that left me perpetually uneasy. She remembered everyone's allergies, sent thoughtful thank you notes, and called Eleanor Mom with a casual warmth that made my own skin prickle. She was, as my own mother would sigh, a keeper. But to Thomas, she was something else entirely, a possession, the ultimate accessory, the final gleaming piece in the puzzle of his life that once placed would somehow erase the ghost of the piece that had been violently removed. I watched him from my seat beside Richard. Thomas's face, handsome in a sharp, almost cruel way, was flushed with a combination of birthday wine and something darker, a simmering excitement that had been building all evening. His eyes, the same cold blue as a winter lake, were fixed not on the cake, but on Chloe. There was a possessiveness in that gaze that went beyond love, edging into territory that made me want to slide my chair back a few inches. "Make a wish, sweetheart," Eleanor chirped, her voice a note too high. Her eyes, however, darted nervously between her son and the girlfriend she adored a little too obviously, as if trying to preempt any potential for drama. Thomas leaned forward. The room fell into that strange, suspended silence that only exists around a birthday cake, broken by the faint, tinny pop music from a speaker in the corner. He drew in a deep, theatrical breath, his chest expanding. For a second, I thought he'd do the normal thing, wish for a promotion, a new car, world peace, something banal and safe. Then he blew. Not a gentle puff, but a hard, violent exhalation that snuffed out every single flame in one furious gust. Smoke tendrils curled into the air, carrying the acrid scent of extinguished wicks. And he spoke. His voice wasn't a whisper, but a clear, ringing declaration filled with a grotesque cheer. "I wish my girlfriend would die so I could finally be an only child again." The silence that followed was no longer suspended. It was a physical thing, a vacuum that sucked all the air, all the sound, all the warmth from the room. The tinny music from the speaker seemed to swell for a horrific second before someone, Richard I think, jerked the plug from the wall. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror that was not just shock, but a deep, recognizing dread. Richard's face turned to stone, the glass in his hand trembling slightly, ice cubes clinking a frantic tattoo. My own blood turned to ice. I stared at my best friend, a man I'd known for 26 years, and saw a stranger. The words echoed in the dead air, senseless and vile. Finally be an only child again. Chloe. I whipped my head towards her. The serene smile was still there, frozen in place. But her eyes were no longer looking at Thomas. They were looking through him, through the cake, through the wall behind him, at something only she could see. A terrible, blank understanding was settling into her features, smoothing them into a mask of eerie calm. She didn't look hurt, or angry, or even surprised. She looked like someone who had just heard a secret they'd always known, spoken out loud for the first time. And then I understood. It wasn't about her, not really. The memory slammed into me like the force of a truck. A smaller, sun-drenched dining room from 15 years ago. A cake with 9 candles. A little girl with strawberry blonde braids and a gap-toothed grin leaning over beside her brother to blow them out. Lily, Thomas's twin sister, the other half of his soul, until a rainy afternoon and a distracted driver took her 8 months after that birthday. Thomas had never recovered. The bright, mischievous boy I'd known had been buried with her, and in his place had grown this polished, ambitious, hollow man. And Chloe, with her blonde hair and quiet ways, had never been just Chloe. She was the stand-in, the replacement goldfish for the sister's absence was a hole in the universe he couldn't fill. He hadn't wished for Chloe to die because he hated her. He'd wished for her to die because in his twisted, grieving psyche, her death would erase the replacement, would reset the clock, would somehow magically restore the original perfect dynamic. Thomas and his parents, an only child, the sole recipient of all their splintered love and attention. "Thomas!" Eleanor gasped, the sound like a punctured lung, her eyes wide with horror that was not just shock, but a deep, recognizing dread. Richard's face turned to stone, the glass in his hand trembling slightly, ice cubes clinking a frantic tattoo. My own blood turned to ice. I stared at my best friend, a man I'd known for 26 years, and saw a stranger. The words echoed in the dead air, senseless and vile. Finally be an only child again. Chloe. I whipped my head towards her. The serene smile was still there, frozen in place, but her eyes were no longer looking at Thomas. They were looking through him, through the cake, through the wall behind him, at something only she could see. A terrible, blank understanding was settling into her features, smoothing them into a mask of eerie calm. She didn't look hurt, or angry, or even surprised. She looked like someone who had just heard a secret they'd always known, spoken out loud for the first time. And then I understood. It wasn't about her, not really. The memory slammed into me like the force of a truck. A smaller, sun-drenched dining room from 15 years ago. A cake with 9 candles. A little girl with strawberry blonde braids and a gap-toothed grin, leaning over beside her brother to blow them out. Lily, Thomas's twin sister, the other half of his soul, until a rainy afternoon and a distracted driver took her 8 months after that birthday. Thomas had never recovered. The bright, mischievous boy I'd known had been buried with her, and in his place had grown this polished, ambitious, hollow man. And Chloe, with her blonde hair and quiet ways, had never been just Chloe. She was the stand-in, the replacement goldfish for the sister's absence was a hole in the universe he couldn't fill. He hadn't wished for Chloe to die because he hated her. He'd wished for her to die because in his twisted, grieving psyche, her death would erase the replacement, would reset the clock, would somehow magically restore the original perfect dynamic. Thomas and his parents, an only child, the sole recipient of all their splintered love and attention. "Thomas," Eleanor gasped, the sound like a punctured lung, her eyes wide with horror that was not just shock, but a deep, recognizing dread. Richard's face turned to stone, the glass in his hand trembling slightly, ice cubes clinking a frantic tattoo. My own blood turned to ice. I stared at my best friend, a man I'd known for 26 years, and saw a stranger. The words echoed in the dead air, senseless and vile. Finally, be an only child again. Chloe. I whipped my head towards her. The serene smile was still there, frozen in place, but her eyes were no longer looking at Thomas. They were looking through him, through the cake, through the wall behind him, at something only she could see. A terrible, blank understanding was settling into her features, smoothing them into a mask of eerie calm. She didn't look hurt, or angry, or even surprised. She looked like someone who had just heard a secret they'd always known, spoken out loud for the first time. And then I understood. It wasn't about her, not really. The memory slammed into me like the force of a truck. A smaller, sun-drenched dining room from 15 years ago. A cake with 9 candles. A little girl with strawberry blonde braids and a gap-toothed grin, leaning over beside her brother to blow them out. Lily, Thomas's twin sister, the other half of his soul, until a rainy afternoon and a distracted driver took her 8 months after that birthday. Thomas had never recovered. The bright, mischievous boy I'd known had been buried with her, and in his place had grown this polished, ambitious, hollow man. And Chloe, with her blonde hair and quiet ways, had never been just Chloe. She was the stand-in, the replacement goldfish for the sister's absence was a hole in the universe he couldn't fill. He hadn't wished for Chloe to die because he hated her. He'd wished for her to die because in his twisted... The days following Chloe's death unfolded with a surreal, slow-motion horror. The city mourned a beautiful, promising young woman taken too soon. The local news ran a somber segment, a photo of her smiling serenely, a shot of the rain-slicked street where it happened, a plea for information about the dark sedan that had fled the scene. It was a tragedy, a random, brutal act of cosmic indifference. But in the silent chambers of my own mind, it felt like anything but random. It felt like a punctuation mark, a period at the end of Thomas's vile, shouted sentence. The funeral was a masterclass in Logan family repression. It was held in the same non-denominational chapel where they'd held Lily's service 15 years prior. The same faint smell of lemon polish and wilted lilies. The same low, organ-like hum of the ventilation system. Eleanor Logan, swathed in black, was a pillar of dignified grief, accepting condolences with a trembling chin and tearless eyes. Richard stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his face a clenched fist of stoicism. They were playing their parts perfectly, the devastated parents of their son's lost love. And Thomas was the star of the show. He stood at the head of the receiving line, looking heartbreakingly handsome in a tailored black suit. His eyes were red-rimmed. His posture spoke of a weight almost too great to bear. He clutched a single white rose, and when people approached, he would grasp their hands in both of his voice a hoarse, broken whisper. "Thank you for coming. She was everything." I watched him from the back of the chapel, nausea churning in my gut. I'd seen this performance before. After Lily died, he'd been the grieving brother, the one who bore up so bravely, the one who comforted his parents. He'd learned then the currency of performed sorrow, and he was spending it lavishly now. When my turn came, he pulled me into a tight, shuddering hug. I could feel the eyes of the room on us, the best friend offering silent support. He smelled of expensive cologne and mint. "Sam," he breathed into my ear, the word thick with apparent emotion, then lower so only I could hear, the tone shifting into something flat and urgent. "We need to talk. After. My place." He pulled back, his face instantly recomposed into a mask of anguish. I just nodded, my own face frozen. The reception was at the Logan house, the same dining room where just over a week ago Thomas had made his wish, now groaned under platters of cold cuts and casseroles brought by neighbors. The ghost of the chocolate cake seemed to linger in the air. People spoke in hushed tones. Such a tragedy. So senseless. He's holding up so well, poor boy. I found Eleanor in the kitchen, mechanically refilling a water pitcher. Her hands were shaking. "Eleanor," I said softly. She jumped, sloshing water onto the granite. "Oh, Sam, you startled me. I'm so sorry. For everything." She looked at me then, and for a split second, the perfect mask of the grieving, almost mother-in-law slipped. In her eyes I saw a reflection of the same cold dread that had taken root in me. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a watery gratitude. "Thank you, dear. You've always been such a good friend to Thomas." She paused, her gaze drifting to the window overlooking the back garden. "He needs his friends now, more than ever." There was an emphasis on the last two words that felt like a warning. An hour later, I escaped to Thomas's apartment. He lived in a trendy loft downtown, all exposed brick and steel beams. It was unnervingly tidy. Chloe's presence was visible, a cashmere throw neatly folded over the back of the modernist sofa, a shelf of literary fiction that I knew wasn't his, a single orchid on the kitchen island, still blooming. It felt like a museum exhibit, the life of the perfect couple. Thomas had changed into jeans and a dark sweater. He handed me a glass of bourbon, neat, and took a long swallow of his own. The raw, grieving performance was gone. In its place was a wired, almost frenetic energy. "They have no leads, the police. The car was stolen, dumped in the river. No witnesses who got a plate. It's a dead end." "That's awful," I managed, the words ash in my mouth. "Is it?" He stopped pacing and turned to look at me. His blue eyes were clear, sharp, focused. There was no grief in them. There was calculation. "It means it's over, Sam. Clean. No messy questions." I stared at him. "What are you saying?" He came and sat on the leather ottoman opposite me, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm saying it's done, Sam. The wish. It worked." The room seemed to tilt. "Thomas, don't even start with that. A woman is dead. Chloe is dead. This isn't some fairy tale curse. It was a hit and run." "You think I don't know that?" he snapped, but there was no heat in it, only a strange giddy certainty. "But why then? Why her? Why that night? I wished it, Sam. I put it out into the world, and the world listened." He took another drink, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth, the same smile he'd had blowing out the candles. "It listened because it was true. It was the truest thing I've ever said. All that clutter, all that noise she brought, trying to be Lily, trying to be part of the family. It's finally quiet." I felt a rage so pure and cold it was like being injected with ice. She wasn't trying to be Lily. She was trying to love you. And you wished her into a gutter. For a second, something flickered in his eyes. Not guilt, but annoyance, as if I were being deliberately obtuse. "You're not seeing the bigger picture. It's fixed now. The dynamic. It's back to how it should be. Mom and Dad are focused. On us. On the family. The real family." He sounded like a cult member who had just witnessed a miracle. I realized with a dawning, sickening clarity that he wasn't just unremorseful, he was grateful. "You need help, Tom," I said low. "Serious, professional help. You're talking like a madman." He waved a dismissive hand. "I'm talking like someone who finally understands how things work. Cause and effect. Ask for what you want. Mean it." He stood up, refilling his glass. "And I want things to be good again, Sam. I want my family back, and now I have them." I left soon after, the bourbon untouched. Walking to my car, the cool night air did nothing to clear the fog of revulsion in my head. I kept seeing Chloe's face in her apartment. A wish that loud, that honest, it creates a ripple. Had she felt it coming? Had she, in some way, accepted it? The next week was a blur of grim routine. I went to work, I came home, I avoided Thomas's calls. I was adrift, burdened by a secret too monstrous to share. Who would believe me? They'd say I was conflating a cruel joke with a tragic coincidence, but Thomas wasn't grieving. That was the heart of the horror. It was on a Thursday evening when I was numbly scrolling through the news on my phone that I saw it. A small follow-up article on the hit and run. The police had recovered a partial fingerprint from the interior door handle of the dumped sedan. It didn't match any in their databases. The investigation was ongoing, but stalling. A partial print, a dead end. But it was a fact, a tiny physical piece of evidence in the real world that contradicted Thomas's mystical narrative. It was a thread. I clung to it. The following Saturday, Richard Logan called me. He asked me to come over, saying he needed to talk, that it wasn't something for the phone. His voice was heavy, exhausted. When I arrived, Eleanor was out, at the garden club, Richard said, a hollow echo of normalcy. He led me not into the living room, but into his study, a dark-paneled sanctum that always smelled of leather and old paper. He closed the door firmly. He didn't offer me a drink. He just stood behind his massive oak desk, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Sam," he began, his voice gravelly, You've been Thomas's friend a long time. You were there the night before Chloe died." "I was," I said carefully. He said something unforgivable. Richard's eyes, usually so shrewd and controlled, were haunted. Eleanor tries to pretend it was a joke, a moment of poor taste. She has to believe that, for her own sanity. He paused, swallowing hard. "I can't." My pulse quickened. "What do you believe, Richard?" He turned and looked out the window at the manicured lawn. "I believe my son is sick. I've believed it for a long time, since Lily." The name hung in the room, more potent than ever. His grief, it didn't soften into memory. It hardened into something else, an entitlement, a belief that the universe owed him recompense for taking her. Chloe was part of that, a proxy, and when having her didn't fix the hole, his frustration, it curdled. He turned back to me, and his face was etched with a fear I'd never seen in him. "The police came by yesterday, asking more questions. Routine, they said." But the text message burned in my vision, brighter than the neon sign of the bar where I now sat, 3 blocks from Thomas's sterile loft. I'd made an excuse, a sudden splitting headache, and fled, the cordial smile on my face feeling like a rictus grin. I'd driven nowhere, ended up here, in the amber gloom of a dive called The Anchor, where the smell of stale beer and disinfectant was a welcome assault on my senses. It was real, tangible, unlike the chilling fantasy I'd just escaped. The job is done, balance is restored. It was a confirmation and a conclusion. It turned Thomas from a potentially deluded monster into a calculating one. The wish wasn't magic. It was a cover story he was telling himself, a fairy tale to absolve him of the blood on his hands. He'd wished out loud to give the act a veneer of the supernatural, a twisted destiny, when in reality, he'd just placed an order. I ordered a whiskey, double, and drank it in one searing gulp. My hands were trembling. Richard's haunted face swam before me. Stay close to him. Watch him. I had, and I'd seen the devil's receipt. What was my debt now? To Richard? To Chloe's memory? To the basic crumbling foundations of justice? I was an accomplice after the fact, just by knowing, by sitting across from him, drinking his beer, listening to his plans for a family boating trip. The weight of it threatened to crush me. I couldn't go to the police. What did I have? A text preview I'd seen for 2 seconds on a locked phone from an unknown number with phrasing vague enough to be about anything? The job. A landscaper. A mechanic. A hitman. Thomas would laugh in their faces. His father, the respected businessman, would provide an alibi. I'd look like a grief-stricken friend seeing conspiracies. And Richard, he'd asked me to find the truth, but did he want me to act on it? His primary emotion had been terror. Terror of the truth and terror of what Thomas might become with the confirmation of his own power. Turning in his only remaining child would destroy Eleanor and likely Richard himself. I was trapped in a silent, suffocating box with the truth. The next morning, I did the only thing I could think to do. I drove to the public library, a grand old building that felt like a sanctuary of facts. I needed to ground myself in the reality of the investigation, to see if the real world had any threads I could pull. I found a secluded carrel and opened my laptop. The news articles on Chloe's death were sparse. The hit and run was already fading from the headlines. Another urban tragedy. I dug deeper, into local crime blogs and police blotter summaries. The partial fingerprint had yielded no matches. The stolen sedan had been wiped clean, aside from that one smudged print. No surveillance cameras had caught the incident on that leafy residential street at the exact wrong moment. It was, as the detective quoted in one piece said, frustratingly clean. Clean, the word Thomas had used. A wave of revulsion washed over me. On a whim, my fingers stiff and cold on the keys, I searched for Lily Logan accident. The results were fewer, older, digital ghosts from a simpler internet age. A scanned article from the local paper, twin sister killed in tragic pedestrian accident. It was a rainy afternoon. Lily had been chasing her soccer ball into the street. The driver, a 72-year-old man named Harold Mills, had been blinded by the downpour and a sudden glare off a wet windshield. He'd been devastated, charged with misdemeanor vehicular manslaughter. He died of a heart attack 6 months later, an open and shut case of a terrible, tragic mistake. I stared at the pixelated photo of Harold Mills, a kind-looking man with sad eyes. A random event, a life shattered by happenstance. That was the official story, the story that had broken Thomas and set him on this path. But sitting there, with the phantom of Thomas's text message hovering before me, a new hideous question bloomed in my mind. Was it random? Thomas was 9, capable of a childhood grudge, of a fit of rage, but not of orchestrating a death. But the seed of an idea, that a person could be removed to solve a problem, where had that seed been planted? In the fertile, grief-ravaged soil of his childhood? Had he, in some dark corner of his soul, wished for Lily to disappear too? A sibling rivalry taken to its absolute, unthinkable extreme? And when the accident happened, had a part of him, a part he'd never dare acknowledge, felt a guilty, shameful sense of relief, of wish fulfillment. I slammed the laptop shut, my breath coming in short gasps. I was spiraling. I was starting to see patterns in the chaos, connections in the static. Thomas was infecting me with his warped cosmology. I needed air. I needed something solid. I left the library and drove to the only place that held a memory of the boy I'd once known before the fracture. It was our old middle school, a sprawling brick complex. I parked and walked around to the back, to the overgrown edge of the soccer field that bled into a small forgotten copse of trees. Our fort, mine, Thomas, and Lily's. The piece of corrugated metal we'd used as a roof was long gone, rusted into nothing, but the large moss-covered stone we'd used as a seat was still there. I sat on it, the damp chill seeping through my jeans. Here, we'd plotted adventures. Here, Thomas had once, after Lily scraped her knee, solemnly used his cleanest bandana to make a sling for her teddy bear. Here, we had been a trio. The memory was a physical ache. Where had that boy gone? Was he still in there, buried under layers of pathology and rot? Or had he been consumed entirely? My phone buzzed. It was Thomas. "Hey, you bolted last night. Headache better? Mom's making a big family dinner Sunday. Just us. She insisted I ask you. Says you're part of the family. 6 p.m. Don't be late." The casual tone, the presumption, the inclusion into the sacred just us circle, an invitation to break bread at the altar of his crime. My stomach turned. But Richard's plea echoed, stay close to him. And now, a new desperate need was taking root in me. I had to know for sure. I had to see the mechanism. I couldn't live in this limbo of suspicion. I texted Dak, "Sure, see you then." Sunday arrived, heavy and gray. The Logan house felt different. The lingering scent of funeral casseroles was gone, replaced by the rich, homey aroma of Eleanor's pot roast. But the atmosphere was thicker, more charged. It was a celebration of closure, though only 3 of us knew what had truly been closed. Eleanor was brighter, almost manic in her hospitality. She fussed over the table settings, over the doneness of the meat, over whether Thomas was eating enough. Her love, once fractured between a memory of a daughter and the needs of a son, then briefly diverted to Chloe, was now a laser beam focused entirely on Thomas. He basked in it. The prodigal son returned to a kingdom of one. Richard was quiet, watchful. His eyes kept finding mine across the table, asking silent questions I couldn't answer. The conversation was a minefield of normalcy. Thomas talked about the cabin trip with an enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. Eleanor chimed in about the fresh mountain air being just what we need to move forward. Richard nodded along, a man playing his part in a play whose script he despised. Then, as Eleanor brought out a cherry pie, Thomas's favorite, not chocolate cake, he leaned back in his chair, the patriarch of his tiny, perfect world. "You know, it's amazing how things work out, how the universe corrects itself." Eleanor's smile tightened imperceptibly. Richard froze, a forkful of pie halfway to his mouth. "I mean, you try to build something, you bring in new elements, try to make them fit, but sometimes the original blueprint is the only one that works. You can't force a square peg into a round hole. Eventually, the extra piece just gets discarded, and everything is stronger for it." He wasn't talking about Chloe, not explicitly. He was talking about philosophy, about life, but his eyes, gleaming in the candlelight, held a triumphant secret knowledge. "Thomas, that's a rather harsh way of looking at things," Eleanor said softly, her eyes on her plate. "Is it?" He took a sip of wine. "It's just reality, Mom. Pruning makes the tree grow stronger. You have to be willing to cut away the dead weight to preserve the healthy core." He looked at me directly then. "Don't you think, Sam?" He was testing me, including me in his circle of understanding. He wanted my complicity, my silent assent to his diseased logic. Richard's warning flashed in my mind. He might boast about it. To you. This was the boast, veiled in metaphor, but a boast nonetheless. I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I think it depends on whether you're pruning deadwood or cutting down a healthy branch just because it's in your life." For 3 days, I was a ghost in my own life. I went to work, filed reports, attended meetings, all while the 2 letters K burned a hole in the center of my mind. As before. The phrase was a key turning in a lock I was terrified to open. The boy who'd bandaged a teddy bear was gone. In his place was a man who had, at the age of 9, possibly wished his sister dead, and then, as an adult with resources, had found a way to make his darkest desires manifest, not once, but twice. Chloe's death was no longer an isolated horror. It was the second verse of a hideous hymn. I couldn't tell Richard. Not yet. The truth about Lily would destroy him utterly. He'd survived her loss by clinging to the story of a random accident. To learn it was orchestrated by his own son, it would be a murder of its own kind. And Eleanor? Her sanity was a pane of glass already cracked. This would shatter it. I was alone with the knowledge, and the knowledge was a poison. I had to know who Kay was. It was no longer about proof for the police or closure for Richard. It was about understanding the monster my friend had become. I needed to see the instrument he'd used. The text had said, the usual place, somewhere they'd met before, somewhere discreet. I thought of all the places Thomas frequented, the upscale steakhouse where he took clients, the members-only athletic club, the driving range. All were too public for this kind of conversation. Then I remembered. The cabin. The Logan family retreat up north, 3 hours away in the pine-covered hills, isolated, private, a place where family business was often discussed. Thomas had mentioned going there with his parents soon. Had he and Kay met there before, for the planning of the first job? It was a thin thread, but it was all I had. I called in sick on Friday, a lie that came easily to my now familiar lips. I packed a bag with dark clothes, binoculars, a camera with a long lens I'd used for a brief photography phase, and a cold resolve I didn't know I possessed. The drive to the lake region was a journey into a postcard. Dense forests of pine and birch gave way to glimpses of deep blue water. The air grew cooler, scented with sap and damp earth. It was a place for family memories, for laughter around a fire. The perfect camouflage for evil. I didn't go to the cabin itself. I knew the area from years of visiting as Thomas's friend. About a mile down the winding lake road, there was an old Forestry Service pull-off, overgrown and forgotten. I parked my car there, tucked behind a thicket of alders, and continued on foot, a hoodie pulled over my head. The Logan cabin was a beautiful A-frame of cedar and glass, perched on a slope overlooking the water. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. They were already here. I circled wide, through the woods, keeping to the thickest cover, until I found a vantage point on a higher ridge, about 200 yards away, screened by a stand of young pines. I lay on the damp ground, the smell of moss and decay in my nostrils, and trained the binoculars on the cabin. Through the large living room window, I could see the tableau. Eleanor was knitting in an armchair by the fire, a picture of domestic tranquility. Richard was at the dining table, a map spread before him, but he wasn't looking at it. He was staring into the middle distance, a statue of quiet despair. And Thomas was pacing. He held his phone, checking it, putting it down again, picking it up. He was waiting. My muscles ached with tension. The afternoon light began to slant, painting long shadows across the clearing. Then, at precisely 4 p.m., a vehicle appeared on the gravel drive. Not a car, but a dark green, unmarked panel van. Practical. Anonymous. A man got out. He was of average height and build, dressed in jeans, work boots, and a nondescript navy jacket. He moved with an economical, effortless grace that spoke of controlled power. He had close-cropped gray hair and a face that was neither handsome nor ugly, but utterly forgettable. The kind of face you'd pass in a supermarket and not recall a second later. This was Kay. Thomas came out onto the porch. There was no handshake. Thomas spoke, his body language tense, eager. Kay listened, his face a blank slate. He nodded once, then turned and went to the back of the van. He didn't retrieve a toolbox or a package. He pulled out a small, professional-grade leaf blower. My breath caught in my throat. Of course, the cover. He was the groundskeeper, the seasonal caretaker who took care of things for the family, who had access, who belonged here, who could come and go without suspicion. Keeper. The pun was both grotesque and perfect. I watched as Kay proceeded to do a meticulous, utterly normal job. He cleared the porch of pine needles, blew leaves from the gravel path, his movements practiced and smooth. He was a phantom in plain sight. After about 20 minutes, he shut off the blower. He and Thomas exchanged a few more words. Thomas handed him a white envelope, thick, cash, payment for services rendered. Kay tucked it inside his jacket without looking at it, gave a final curt nod, and got back in his van. He drove away, leaving no trace but a temporarily tidy yard. The transaction was complete, quiet, professional, banal. My mind raced. This was how it was done, not in shadowy alleys, but in the dappled sunlight of a family retreat, not with dramatic pronouncements, but with the whisper of a leaf blower and an envelope of cash. The horror was in its normality. As the van disappeared down the road, a new, more immediate terror seized me. The meeting was over. Thomas's business was concluded. What if they decided to take a walk? What if they came up this very ridge? I was an intruder in their sacred, bloody space. I began to inch backwards, keeping low. My foot snagged on a root. I stumbled, my elbow thudding into a rotten log with a soft, wet crunch. Through the binoculars, I saw Thomas's head snap up. He was looking directly toward my position. He couldn't possibly see me, but he'd heard something. He stared for a long, tense moment. Then he said something to Richard inside and started walking toward the tree line, not on the path, but heading straight into the woods, toward me. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through me. I scrambled back, no longer caring about noise, my only thought to put distance between us. I crashed through undergrowth, branches whipping at my face. I could hear him behind me now, his footsteps quicker, more purposeful. "Hello?" His voice called out, echoing slightly in the woods. It wasn't a friendly call, it was a challenge. "Who's there?" I ran, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I was disoriented, the fading light making every tree look the same. I hit a deer trail and sprinted along it, my lungs burning. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out onto the main road, far from where I'd hidden my car. I heard no more pursuit. Doubled over, gasping, I forced myself to walk, not run, along the gravel shoulder. It took me 30 agonizing minutes to find my car. I slid inside, locked my doors, and sat there trembling, covered in dirt and pine needles, the taste of fear metallic in my mouth. He'd almost seen me. He knew someone had been watching. The drive home was a blur of paranoia. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror felt predatory. By the time I stumbled into my dark apartment, I was a wreck. I poured a drink but couldn't bring it to my lips. My hands shook too violently. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Thomas. Hey, weird thing up at the cabin. Heard something in the woods. Probably a bear, but it spooked Mom. This place is getting overgrown. Need to have the keeper do a more thorough job next time. The message was casual, innocent, but it felt like a snake coiling in my palm. The keeper. He'd used the term. Was it a coincidence? Or was it a message for me? A subtle, knowing threat? I know someone was there. I have a keeper who handles overgrowth and other things. I didn't reply. I couldn't. The next morning, my doorbell rang. I peered through the peephole. A delivery man stood there with a long, narrow cardboard box. Flowers for Samuel, he said. Confused, I signed for it. The box was unmarked. Inside, nestled in green tissue paper, was not a bouquet, but a single, pristine stem. It was a lily. Stargazer, I think they were called. Deep pink with freckles, intensely fragrant. There was no card. I stood in my hallway holding the beautiful, deadly bloom. It was a message, clearer than any text. It was a symbol of the first debt, the original sin. It was a reminder that Kay kept more than just lawns tidy. He kept secrets buried, and it was a warning, elegant and horrifying. He knew. Maybe not that it was me specifically in the woods, but he knew his secret was under observation. The lily was a shot across the bow, a display of his reach, his knowledge, his chilling poetry. The doorbell had been a test, to see if I was home, to see my face. I threw the lily in the trash, but its cloying scent filled my apartment for hours, a ghost I couldn't exorcise.